Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John V. Kofus has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brief discussion on the prospect of a global war. Um, the, as everyone knows, the two global wars that we have in modern history are, of course, the first and the second. In fact, when the first broke out, they did not call it World War One. It was called the Great War. Obviously, they did not anticipate another one coming. No one does. Just as we hope and pray that there is not a third World War. Um, the definition of a world war is not necessarily that every single country on this planet is involved, rather that the great powers, and in the time of the First World War, 1914-1918, in fact, it was the great European powers joined by the United States. Eventually, after Wilson won his second presidential term in 1916, and then in 1917, the U.S. entered the war on the side of Britain and France. That war actually, according to many scholars, is called the Unfinished War because of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And many regard the second one, World War II, as a continuation of the first one. So the two global wars are seen as linked. Now, the conditions of that existed between 1870 to 1914 that resulted in a global war, the first global war in modern era, um, were that the great powers were engaged in intense antagonism for two things: geopolitical and geoeconomic supremacy. And within those great powers, two specifically, Great Britain and Germany, especially after the death, after rather not the death, but after Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany dismissed Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, it became very clear that Germany wanted both um, land-based supremacy on the continent as well as naval supremacy, therefore challenging Britain's naval supremacy. Britain was the supreme naval power of the 19th as well as early 20th century. Now, conditions are somewhat similar. Obviously, there is no such thing as history repeating itself. Historical patterns repeat themselves, not obviously the events. It goes without saying. Um, but clearly, the conditions that we have today are alarming. And one of the things that I want to start with, having explained that global war doesn't mean every country is involved, but that the major powers seeking hegemony, domination for geopolitical and geoeconomic reasons, in other words, to determine the balance of power, or as many world leaders today point out, determine the rules of the international order, um, as well as gain access to markets and have economic domination as well. So political slash military as well as economic hegemony or domination are the goals that drive countries, have driven countries in the past, and remain to this day, as we will see. These are the preconditions for conflict. Now, what happens is that the great powers, back then, of course, Germany versus Britain, they have allies, lesser allies, and they drag them along. And back then, they had, of course, colonies drag them along as well. So that's when it becomes a global war. In other words, it's internationalized. There are a lot more countries than just two or three major players involved. And some of the conditions, again, like I said, that existed back then, the race of imperialist powers, by the way, and to some degree, rivals themselves and analysts and advisors to heads of state agree that to some degree there is this race of imperialism, neo imperialism today, whether it's China pursuing global economic hegemony, which it is, by the way, the United States seeking global economic hegemony using military means to achieve that, and dragging NATO along and dragging allies, roughly 35 to 40 allies, solidly behind that bloc, versus the China slash Russia BRICS bloc, which has a lot more because of the popularity of BRICS in the global south, and because, for a very simple reason, that China is the world's number one economic power when its GDP, according to the IMF and World Bank, is measured in purchasing power parity rather than nominal value. Um, when measured in purchasing power parity (PPP) terms, rather than nominal value, it's about 7.5 trillion ahead of the United States. Therein rests the problem. The problem is that the United States wants to keep its hegemony, the American century, which is essentially the 20th century, from the time of President Wilson to Richard Nixon, the end of the Vietnam War. That's the American century. They want to keep that. Well, the fact is that the economy of the United States, again, measured in not in nominal value but in PPP terms, right now is far weaker than that of China. Even worse, in a few years, there are different estimates by private firms as well as international financial organizations like the IMF, World Bank. Within a few years, China will overtake the United States very easily in nominal value as well, by the way. Right now, it's in PPP terms. So the US having the military as the only leverage, because it doesn't have the economy, by the way, it's seeking to use it in order to achieve global dominance. And to do that, its strategy has been number one, to stop China and its key ally, Russia. That is a prescription through a containment policy, as we'll see, containment militarism, and I'll explain what that is in due course. Containing Russia, weakening Russia, as President Biden very clearly and plainly has said, we want to punish them, we want to weaken them, okay? And we want to contain China, agitate in South China Sea using the Philippines and Taiwan as leverage, Japan, South Korea, see what we can do there. Just contain China and destabilize key parts of the world, from Ukraine through the Transcaucasus region to the Middle East, to the South China Sea. Destabilizing, according to the US strategy, will achieve the desired goal of weakening China, at least slowing it down, so that the American century of the 20th century can continue in the 21st. Obviously, um, so far, not only has this not worked, it has backfired for the US. It has backfired for the US. It has also backfired on a massive scale for America's NATO allies, especially seen very clearly during the Ukraine war, which is a conventional war, and then, of course, the one down in the Middle East, which is that Israel is carrying out, which is a genocidal campaign against civilians as determined by the International Criminal Court, then the International Court of Justice. Not my definition. International organizations have already have reached their conclusions. The United Nations, number of United Nations representatives have said the exact same thing. That this is indeed a not a conventional war, but rather genocide. Behind both is the United States. Behind both, the United States is the key, and behind both is the threat of a global war. And I want to mention that there has been enormous coverage on the prospect of a global war, World War III, for different reasons, by the way. Let's take the doves, the people who don't want that, for obvious reasons, who wants to destroy the planet. The people who honestly want to avoid it argue that diplomacy and negotiated solutions for conflicts, regional conflicts, is the way to go, and to focus on economic strengths rather than to pour money into the parasitic defense sector. Just recently, I read a report by an organization that the world GDP in 2023, to give you an idea of how parasitic the defense sector is, by the way, and how it drains the world economy, and how it impacts the lives of hundreds of millions of people, including Americans and Europeans, by the way. Okay. The world economy in 2023 was estimated 105 trillion. The world GDP, roughly 105 trillion. Of that, 19.1 trillion was the cost related to military defense aspects, which is roughly 18%, something like that. 18% of global GDP was absorbed in 2023. And I'll get, by the way, to more specific numbers on which side spends what in due course. Roughly 18% of world GDP was drained. The cost to the civilian economy, according to this organization, was 19.1 trillion out of 105 trillion in 2023. This impacted the entire world and living standards across the entire world. This amount of money is far greater than it would take to eradicate poverty on a world scale. End it completely. Instead of having vacuous rhetoric from whether it's from the United Nations or individual governments. Oh, yes, we're going to eradicate poverty. Just reduce defense. That will eradicate poverty. This amount of money is also important because it indicates the cost for refugees running from countries from Yemen to Afghanistan to Syria to Iraq, um, throughout the Middle East, okay, Palestine included. The cost uh, to estimated is in this, and the impact is for over 100 million people on this planet, with many countries bearing the burden. Okay, and the destabilization of the United States and its allies at the regional level, and forcing countries to spend more on defense as they have since the Ukraine war started, and then Israel on top of that. More countries, according to this study, have poured more on defense, um, as they become apprehensive about each other, about their neighbors. So they pour more on defense, weakening the civilian economy. So there is a global sense of apprehension about imminent conflict that can get out of hand. It may start by accident, um, or it may be well laid out and planned. No one knows, but there is fear. So the doves, as I started to say, have been warning about this, whether it in scholarly articles or in newspapers, magazines, online videos, whatever. Then there is another group who has taken up this issue of the prospects of global war. That's the hawks, the people who actually use this issue in order to argue, yes, get ready for it, prepare. In fact, there are how to videos, which reminds me of stuff they used to do back in the 1950s and the 1960s in the United States. In case of a nuclear war, hide under, telling the school children, by the way, hide under your desk in school. Yes, that would definitely protect you. Um, Now the fact is that the hogs, the warmongers, if you will, the pushers of war, um, um, those who advocate a resolution of conflict through military means, is a polite way of saying it. Those people usually represent the defense sector. They represent far right, but also liberal militarists. In Germany, even the Greens turned out to be very militaristic, right? So they represent ideological and economic and political interests, which they believe will somehow advance civilization through war. And they have no hesitation embracing some of the neoconservative um, theories. I mention neoconservatives, by the way, because both in Europe and the United States, they have been advising governments. And these are the people who believe in the forever war doctrine, and they don't want to hear about peace. They they pay lip service. They will tell the press, "Oh yes, we love peace. We want peace. We're negotiating. We're trying to negotiate the solution." And at every turn, they increase defense budgets. They pour money into existing wars, existing civil wars, and a conventional war in Ukraine, and the genocidal war in Israel. These are the same people. However, they tell the press, of course, we're peace loving people. It reminds me, I was in high school during the later years of the Vietnam War, when President Johnson used to say that he loved peace, he hated war, and that his wife loved peace, she hated war, and yet there was escalation of war. Okay, so you have to be aware that these people, there are two schools of thought: the doves who are warning about World War III and arguing that what we have is the possibility of the end of our planet, because 9 countries, the so-called nuclear club, have nuclear weapons. Russia and China combined have the most warheads, by the way. Those are enough to end the planet, life on the planet. You don't need any more. That's it. End of life on the planet. Okay, whatever life will be left, as Noam Chomsky has said, and rightly so, the lucky ones, and he's not the only one. Many have said this, but um, I highly respect Noam Chomsky. He's right that the lucky ones will be the ones who are dead. So there's that group. And then there are those who advocate escalation of militarism and celebrate the prospect of even more conflict, more destabilization. All of this, which may lead us to global war. Now, there is another dimension to the those scholars who study and write about World War III prospects, and that is, and it's been talked about in newspapers, magazines, online, everywhere. Obviously, not just in the limited domain of academia, and that is economic warfare, sanctions. That's a form of warfare. It's economic warfare. Tariffs, okay? Um, Preventing technology transfers through punitive or halting on the part of the United States against China, obviously, or China just recently halting some rare earth minerals. By the way, some of you may be familiar with what that is. China has most of the world's rare earth minerals and processes most of them on the planet. Although there are other countries, from South Africa to Kyrgyzstan to Russia, a few other countries, China has the most and processes the most on a world scale. Without rare earth minerals, the defense sector and high tech areas can't continue for very long. Just recently, China held back on export of a key rare earth mineral used in the defense sector to the United States. So that's the kind of thing that has you scratching your head, because this tit for tat, this back and forth between the U.S. With the ban of semiconductor exports to China, China hitting back with rare earth minerals, plus punishing companies, by the way, that supply weapons to Taiwan, which is obvious. For why would they supply weapons to Taiwan? Taiwan, the Chinese assumed that this issue was settled a long time ago, and that the one China policy was agreed to by the United States and internationally. If you're going to destabilize in South China Sea and Taiwan, that means you're reaching for war. This is not to say, by the way, that China is made up of angels and that they are peace loving. On the contrary, they have recently increased their military budget. Everybody has. And they are also seeking hegemony. They're seeking economic hegemony. They are not interested in an all-out war. In fact, they're not interested in military destabilization, geopolitical destabilization, and militarism as a solution. They're interested in diplomacy. However, they're not blind. They are also preparing. And the economic warfare of sanctions, tariffs, export bans, and all of that is a part of the overall strategy of punishing the other country, and adds to the climate of antagonism and aggression, which has many people assuming, okay, at some point there will be an explosion, we'll have World War III. I want to uh, touch upon a number of theories of war. There have been many theories of war. One is that human nature, human beings, are warlike creatures. We're violent. Actually, it is true that human beings, that an aspect of human nature is prone to violence, an aspect of human nature. It is also true that environmental conditions, social conditions, political conditions, economic conditions, indoctrinate the human mind and force the individual to become more violent. If there is structural violence, warfare is structural violence, by the way. If there is structural violence, it filters down to culture. So there's cultural violence and it filters down to individual violence. I dealt with this issue in a separate video on human nature and war. There is nothing in human nature that we can prove scientifically that human beings are predisposed to wanting the annihilation of their own species. This is nonsense. There are people in the elites that have been from ancient times to the present, and let's stick with more modern times, who have no qualms about, and we have historical examples to prove that. Obviously, the worst case was Adolf Hitler, who believed he was Germany, the Third Reich. He was the Third Reich. So if he was not going to be around, there was no need for Germany to be around. Let everybody die. So there are the elites within a society and the elites that make policy decisions, because war is a policy decision, just like diplomacy is a policy decision. And those policy decisions are not made by a bricklayer, they're not made by a dock worker, they're not made by a small farmer. They're made by people who have influence in policy. And those people then have a lot of money and an interest in promoting an agenda. Um, the defense companies have an interest in promoting destabilization, because it means more countries are militarizing. They're spending more on defense, so they're making their profits go up. Right? It was assumed, by the way, when the Cold War ended, there would be the peace dividend. I don't know. I'm old enough to remember this. I don't know if anyone else remembers this. Those of you who are like me remember this. The peace dividend. There was never a peace dividend. Very quickly, the United States, under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, opted not to do away with NATO, by the way, and we'll talk about NATO. Like, considering there was no more Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc was abolished. There were individual countries. The Russian Federation was weak under Boris Yeltsin, very weak throughout the 1990s. The US had a choice. The great early Cold War diplomat, in his advanced age, warned at that time that this was a momentous occasion. Kissinger had apprehensions. Kissinger hardly a dove. Kennan was no dove. He started out as a he was the author of the man who provided the doctrine or foundation for the Cold War back in the 40s in the Truman administration. There were people like that who argued that Kissinger argued that the United States had really to put limitations on itself, considering there was no one else to put any limitations on the US in the 1990s during the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And Kennan's argument was, okay, there's no Warsaw Pact. NATO was founded in 49, I believe, was founded as a defense organization against the spread of communism. There was no communism. The Soviet bloc was disbanded. Why expand NATO? There was talk, and I had even written about the idea that we could have had a bit more peace if NATO actually had at least, okay, they decided to keep at least incorporate, and the Russians actually had an interest in this. Um, and I had read about it, and I wrote about the fact that Russia could have been a member of NATO and the European Union. Why not? It's a Eurasian country. And actually, why not incorporate Israel? Get a hold, put some limits on what they're doing to the Palestinians. So there was none of that. The U.S. wanted NATO expansion under its hegemony. This was the time that the U.S. used to strengthen itself. Jeffrey Sachs, who was back then a neoliberal advocate, advising global economic integration, bringing in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc countries, into the capitalist world economy, argues that he proposed loans, aid, so forth, and to economically integrate, not to focus on the military, that the Clinton administration, influenced heavily by the defense sector, according to Sachs, went the route of strengthening NATO and expanding it. And here we are today with the doctrine of a NATO without limits on this planet. By the way, NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Think about that. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It doesn't mean global treaty organization. It was never meant to be that. Today it does mean exactly that. NATO, the reason NATO is supporting Ukraine is because the ultimate goal is containment of Russia, China, and Iran and North Korea. Those four countries that the US considers the axis of evil and the enemy, and blames, and American analysts blame for the possibility of a World War III if it erupts, when in fact those countries are playing defense. And I'll explain the statistics on what US NATO spends in defense versus those four countries. Okay, so the goal in Ukraine today, right now, the goal is not to lose militarily to Russia, so that the US can go right through the Black Sea, Georgia, go through Armenia, Azerbaijan, into the Transcaucasus region and across Central Asia, and contain Russia, use bases along the way in that region, and contain Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. The ultimate goal is military containment, so that the US NATO-led group can retain its hegemony. This is a dream, and it's a prescription for global war, because the other side has nuclear weapons, and as much Russia as China, they will never allow this kind of blatant expansion, this early Cold War advocacy. By the way, I should tell you, since Jeffrey Sachs was in government at the time and he was privy to this stuff, he points out that Joe Biden at the time was the strongest advocate of a strong, expansive NATO. Okay. And I'm not going to name the companies, but some of the biggest defense companies began to lobby very hard for that. So what you have is laying the foundations in the 1990s for the militarism that we get later on. The war on terror, using, of course, the tragic incident in New York and Washington of 9/11, and declaring this war on terror, which leads to U.S. war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we know the results of those. By the way, the world knows the results of those. The Taliban are back in Afghanistan, and Iraq is under Iranian influence, and everyone knows that. Um, anyway, these are dangerous strategies. And here's where I disagree with Jeffrey Sachs, for whom I have enormous respect. He's a brilliant scholar. But I don't believe that it's a matter of people who are not intelligent. I know a number of people that I have known a number of people in government, in very intelligent people. I don't think it's a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of solid interest. The fact is that there are people who represent, through lobbyists, law offices, and so forth, who represent tangible interests, corporate interests that have a stake in destabilization and keeping the world on edge for the prospect of a global war. They make money. It's that simple. They make money. The ultimate goal here is to increase their profits. That's the only way that they make money. The so-called peace dividend that the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, um, that argued about a peace dividend. That was peace dividend. That never really materialized. There was never a peace dividend. Here's the kicker. Here's the unfortunate thing that the Americans or the Japanese or the Europeans never saw coming. That decade that they were planning a NATO expansion. And here's where a boomerang came back to haunt them: China. In the 1990s was a catalyst decade because the US created a unipolar world. Why? It had no rival. It eliminated the Soviet bloc. It bankrupted it by forcing it to spend and spend on defense that it's so weak, and it's true, by the way, they spend enormous amounts on defense, that it's so weak in the civilian economies. Mikhail Gorbachev, I don't know if people remember Gorbachev back in the 80s, a very charismatic figure who wanted a transition, finally decided this is not working. Let's just scrap it. And he dissolved this to save the Russian Federation. He dissolved the Soviet Union and, of course, took a very different course. And then, of course, Yeltsin, extremely weak head of state, came under the influence of Westerners, including Jeffrey Sachs, by the way, on how to integrate the country under capitalism. Um, the I'm gonna move on. I was gonna mention some more theories about why war happens, but there are theories of cyclical hegemony and so forth. Um, Actually, when you look at wars, ethnocentrism, if not racism in some cases, is World War II. Ethnocentrism is there as a key. It is important when taking into account, when those of you who are studying what can go wrong with, God forbid, knock on wood, that we never have a global war, but the geopolitical strategies which are at the forefront really are deceptive in a way because the goals are geoeconomic. Okay. Right now, the US and its partners are trying to stop China. The US thinks, they assume that and of course, unfortunately, they have Japan South Korea and Australia going along with it, that they can force China into weakening its economy the way they forced Russia in the 70s and especially in the 1980s. When in the 1980s, by the way, the Soviets were involved in Afghanistan, were engaged in Afghanistan trying to support a regime that was secular, pro-Soviet and secular. Whereas the U.S. in the 1980s was supporting this through the CIA, was support and the Defense Department was supporting the Mujahideen, right? In other words, the jihadists against the secular government, and they got the Taliban. That was the result. And then they'd go in to make sure that the Taliban were never coming in, were never established a firm hold after the 9/11, and yet the Taliban are back in power because the US, after 20 years, accomplished absolutely nothing and it retreated. This is the result of a ridiculous strategy. Now, in China, the strategy has been to force them to spend more on defense, weaken their civilian economy, so that the US can get some breathing space and get back on its feet. That hasn't worked. The Chinese are not buying any of this. The Chinese have looked from the 1990s to the present very carefully at what happened to the Soviet Union, and they're not following that route. They are narrowly focused on global economic hegemony through the Belt and Road Initiative, okay, which integrates as many countries, first and foremost, obviously, Asia, Africa, but they're in Latin America, they're in Europe. Just recently, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, had a high level meeting with Xi Jinping, and the Premier of China, in Beijing. She tried and tried all these years. She finally saw that there is no alternative to the future, which is China as a global economic hegemon. It's not. It's not the West. It's very simple. It's not the West. Combined with that, when you look at the fact that China is the leader of the BRICS group, and there are countries lining up to join BRICS, and that the BRICS group can easily, which is an economic bloc, by the way, easily undermine the dollar. And many have read stories about how the BRICS group and the oil producing companies can easily undermine the dollar. The US, in other words, is really in a situation where they either can confront these challenges about the transfer of the core in the world economy from the US to China. And that's exactly what's happening. The core of the world economy is shifting from the US to China. The 21st century is the center of China. It's not the United States. However, this is exactly when you get a prescription for global war, because the US has the means for global war. And this brings me to NATO. There was a recent meeting in July in Washington, D.C., of NATO countries to celebrate. And I read much of it. It's a very long document, but when you read it, it's we're going to do this and we're going to do this to strengthen NATO, to expand. Let me give you some statistics about NATO countries. First of all, about the United States. The United States is in 178 countries in the world. It has some kind of a military presence. It also has secret military bases globally, especially in the Middle East, something like 60 in the Middle East alone. And it also uses its troops through joint military adventures with a national group, whether it's Egypt or Taiwan. They're in Taiwan, and it blends in. No country on this planet, no country has a military presence on this scale. This alone has one scratching their head, but that if there is a global war, they have a presence, the US has a presence in almost every country in the world. Okay? That's alarming. The secret bases, the secret military bases, are just as alarming. Now we come to defense expenditures. The US defense budget, which is rising next year, by the way, it's going to go close to a trillion. 1 trillion and 27.5 trillion dollar economy, 1 trillion for defense. Okay. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 or 11 countries combined. The US and NATO spend officially, unofficially, it's twice that, officially 1.5 trillion on defense. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, which the US regards as the enemies to fight in a global war, spend 1/5 of that amount. And they don't have military bases all over the world. They have a few, very few. Russia did get the opportunity. Russia exploits any opportunity you can, and so does China, by the way. Did get the opportunity to have some inroads in Africa recently after Niger and Sudan. They did get some inroads there because of the fact that Africa has had it with the Europeans and the West, and let me give you an example. The French were buying uranium from Niger for $5-6 a kilo when it's trading between 250 and 350, some cases higher than that, in a kilo in the international market. So they obviously keep them out for that, but also for meddling in their internal affairs. They're finished. Russia does exploit all the situations that it can in Africa. Africa is also a place where a continent that's very rich in raw materials, and China has made no secret that it wants a foothold in China. It wants the raw materials, but it does spend on social spending, namely social development as well as economic development, the infrastructure of China, hospitals and schools included, by the way. So, but clearly they're not there because they're nice people. They're there because they see economic advantages, raw materials, cheap labor, and that's where they're there. Um, NATO has a role that is not comparable to that of China, more like Russia, the military route, not economic. So the US is trying to counter Chinese economic integration of the world economy, including, let's say, the continent of Africa, in this case, with what? What is it offering? Military bases. We'll defend you against enemies. And of course, it is no secret that more and more countries are lining up behind BRICS to join BRICS because they see their future in BRICS. Now let me explain the other side on World War III. China and Russia have made it very clear that the unipolar, and including in speeches at the UN Security Council, that the unipolar world order that has existed since George Herbert Walker Bush back in 1990-91 promulgated this, is over. There is going to be a multipolar world order. And this means that the US has to come to terms with reality. And reality is that it cannot continue to impose its military hegemony over the rest of the world and the rules based order, which means US rules based order, nobody else's rules, but America's rules. And that's over. That multilateralism and multi-dimensional power base, a multifaceted power base, is the new reality. The US is trying to prevent exactly that. And the question is, what leverage does the US have? Other than the military, what leverage does it have? The only leverage is the forever war doctrine of the neoconservatives. Hit them with everything you got. Now, the Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia believe that the militarism of the West, of the US led NATO group, is what contributes to the prospect of World War III and global destabilization. And they point to the proxy wars both in Ukraine and Israel right now. And they argue that the United States has zero interest in peace, either in Ukraine or Israel, when the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Tehran recently, and Tehran threatened retaliation unless the U.S. proposed immediate ceasefire and a settlement of the two-state solution in Palestine. There was going to be retaliation. And just this morning, the deputy foreign minister of Iran announced, yes, we will retaliate. Now, what did the U.S. do after that assassination? It provided more military immediately, within a few hours. It provided more military aid to Israel. And when Iran threatened retaliation, send more naval and air power to the Middle East to make sure that they don't try anything. In other words, this is the sort of thing that China and Russia point to, as well as Iran, by the way, and argue, well, here they are with massive firepower, obviously, including nuclear weapons. US, NATO, Israel, nuclear weapons. And they're telling us, who are the victims of destabilization policies that they start, that we are at fault. So this is something that is alarming to the Chinese. The Chinese actually have been very deliberate, very careful to advise Iran not to proceed hastily, to give the United States the time it has requested for a ceasefire. The United States has been on a PR campaign in the last few days saying, don't retaliate. We're very close to a deal with Hamas, and Hamas has categorically rejected that there is any such prospect for a deal. We don't know what they're talking about. But in any case, part of this is psychological warfare. The point is that you can't accuse the group that you are challenging and arguing is a threat to world peace and to possibly causing World War III, when they're on the defensive, when they spend 1/5 of what you spend, when you have military bases all over the world, and they have very few, a couple of dozen combined, if that, by the way, if that. So this is the contradiction here is that. Now, beyond that, the question is, let's come back to a point that many have made, and where is all this headed? This is headed nowhere for the U.S. except a weaker economy. Militarism is not uh, has not helped the U.S. economy at all. It has been a drain, and there are those who have argued, by the way, that we are already in World War III with sanctions, tariffs, regional wars. There's such a massive destabilization campaign in so many parts of the world, from Africa to the Middle East to Ukraine to the South China Sea. They are going, aren't we already in World War III? No, we're not in World War III. But all of these are this is a prelude to a possibility of a global war. One hopes that it doesn't happen because, in the event of a global war that gets out of hand to the degree that the defense ministers and defense secretary, in the case of the United States, stop communication altogether, there are going to be nuclear weapons used. There has been, by the way, I don't want to excuse the Russians. Dmitry Medvedev, who is the hawk in the Russian Kremlin, former president and one of Putin's strongest supporters, Medvedev has argued that Russia should have no qualms about using nuclear weapons. Use nuclear warheads in Ukraine. Use them against the Europeans. The Europeans have been very apprehensive about nuclear war. They're very close to Russia. Europe has a long memory with bad experiences in Russia, from the Napoleonic Wars all the way to the modern, uh, the two global wars in the 20th century. They have not gone well for Europe. They've gone very badly for Europe. Europe has gone along with the United States, taken all the risk, both economically and strategically, hoping that they come out ahead rather than influencing the United States to accept a diplomatic route. The question is, why is this? And here's what I want to link, and I want to end this discussion with this point. Corporate interests, from banks to large corporations, are intertwined with the Chinese economy. Western corporate interests are intertwined with the Western Chinese economy. However, they still support economic nationalism, and they still see Western dominance as something they would like to see, to pursue. Okay. So one might argue that there is an element of social Darwinism behind the warmongering of the Western countries, that they don't want to lose what they have had for the last 500 years of Western global hegemony. It's about to end because now East Asia is replacing the core of the Western global economy, the Northwest Europe and the United States. East Asia is now in that role. It's a fait accompli. It's already happened. It doesn't matter that there is a rejection, and because many use the nominal value of GDP versus the purchasing power parity value, which the IMF and the World Bank use. It doesn't matter that they reject that. The reality is East Asia is the future. India is South Asia, in other words. India, the Indian subcontinent, is right there behind China. Asia will represent, according to studies that have been conducted, the majority of the world GDP very quickly in the next 50 years. Indonesia is going to be another powerhouse, okay, besides India. So between Japan, China, Indonesia, and India, Asia is replacing the West. I have often quoted the great Dutch scholar of the interwar era, Johan Huizinga, whose work I love. And this brilliant man was absolutely correct that when the elites perceive a threat to their status, social status, economic and political status, they become sadistic. The ultimate form of sadism is to take steps to eliminate your own species. World War III. It is, Chomsky is correct that the lucky ones will be those who have perished. We hope this does not happen. We hope that reason prevails. As Eric Fromm in the 1960s wrote in a little book that entitled May Men Prevail, we hope men, that is anthropocentric values, humanistic values, social justice and peace prevails. However, the signs are not encouraging because decision makers are people like Huizinga pointed out in the 1930s who have sadistic tendencies because they see their own positions, their own social status and political and economic status dwindling, and they become defensive and they lash out and they don't care about the level of destruction to the rest of humanity. I want to thank you for listening to all of this. I hope that peace prevails. I hope there's never any kind of war anywhere because World War III is a reality for those, whether in Ukraine or in Gaza. For them, that's World War III. You know, when a father goes to the hospital to register his twin children, I've read this story recently, and the doctors say they were both killed. Both babies were killed by a bomb dropped on the hospital by the IDF, by the Israelis. That's World War III for that man. I hope there's never war. However, the worst case scenario is indeed the one everyone has been warning about. Thank you for listening. Please join this channel, which is educational, intended to bring important issues, not engaged in polemics, but rather through academic analysis of issues for the further understanding, for everybody's further understanding. And I encourage you to, by the way, do your own research on these issues. Join this channel. Asad Alim has been doing a great job. He's expanding the network. And I thank you for listening. Until next time, thank you again.